That song, My Religion's Love, is done by Crystal Harris. And interestingly enough, that was it was performed and presented with the Backstreet Boys. And it was on a CD that people were able to get at Burger King.
Oh, how interesting. Oh.
So if I'll send out the link if people want to know it, but it has a whole bunch of people underneath it commenting of it, because there were many young people who heard the song because it was on the CD that they got in their Burger King Happy Kids food. And it was a piece where it was a little different. It was a female singing with the Backstreet Boys. So a lot of young girls, people that were anywhere from 4 to 14, were listening to her, and they were listening to her in the context of this boy band. So she was able to empower people, empower young women to envision their own capacities to be entertainers, when many times we think of, well, if you're listening to a boy band, it's all of that hoopla about those guys. So the notion that there was this part on this CD could suggest at a subconscious level someone knew that there was something powerful that needed to be presented.
Right.
And that's the place that I want to pick up on in terms of today's talk. Today's talk is what is religion, and Mykal did a reading that characterized some of the features of what is religion. And this is within a broader context of awareness is not enough. That's the theme for this month. How do those two things fit hand in hand? Well, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. Maybe it's not surprising, but when I was a little child, I was raised Roman Catholic, and one of the really big deals for a Roman Catholic is your first communion. So you prepare for it, you study for it, and you're 7 years old. So as a 7-year-old, I don't know how much intellectual capacity I had for understanding the import of what they were trying to say about this sacrament. In Catholicism, one of the ways that this religion expresses is through what are called a series of sacraments. And these are sacred moments. They are times when our regular life stops and something different happens. A word that we use to describe that sacrament is the word numinous. Numinous is the idea of when we've encountered something, and it's inexplicable. We can feel it from our head clear to our toes. It has no word. It can be triggered by all kinds of things. It can be triggered by a particular sunset, and you see it, and you just become one with that sunset. You see a rose, or you see a flower, or you see something beautiful, and you get lost in that beauty. You hear a story, and that story, or you see a movie, and that movie, it tells something about your own life that you couldn't have known before, but it brings it into a place of truth. Has anyone ever had those kinds of experiences? I'm seeing some nods. That notion of the numinous, that's really, in the Roman Catholic tradition, that's what sacramental was about. Sacrament was about fostering conditions that will enable the numinous to come into being. And I would say that is a goal of religious expression. People come into religion because they've had this encounter with the numinous. oftentimes parents will raise their children in a religious tradition because they have had an experience. And they want to pass that on to their children. They want their children to know that. So I tell the story about, at my first communion, I got selected to do a reading. And it was a reading from the Acts of the Apostles. And in that reading of the Acts of the Apostles, it characterized how the apostles, how the early community had come together. In a time where orphans and widows were outcast. At a time when it was a belief that to be a widow or to be an orphan meant that something inside was inherently wrong. Here was a community of people who were turning that upside down. For we're saying it's our responsibility to care for the sick, to care for the orphan, to care for the wounded, to care for the widows. Turning the way things were done on its head. People would come together and share meals. They would break bread together. Again, in the Catholic tradition, the idea of that First Communion was a re-celebration of a meal that this big important guy, Jesus, shared with other people. And other people were having this meal, and they just didn't get it. He was saying that there was something really important in their gathering. They're like, it's just another meal. Well, it was kind of a big deal because it was Passover. And Passover, in the Jewish tradition, is a big deal. But what Jesus was suggesting is, it isn't only about telling and bringing forward all of our history and all of our heritage. It's about us moving forward and recognizing that we are a body of the divine. Now, in the Catholic tradition, that ended up creating doctrines. As a Roman Catholic, we were raised to say that this bread goes through this process called transubstantiation. It stops being bread and it's now the body of Christ. You know, and a lot of people, I don't know about you, Stephanie, but did you have an easy time explaining how this bread is now the body of Jesus? And I remember at a pretty early age, I was thinking, you know, and this is something that was a bubble over my head. I would never have said it in religion class. You know, there's a thing called cannibalism. And if you're eating the body of Christ, that sounds a whole lot like cannibalism. And now again, I was not quite so outspoken that I was going to say that in religion class. But it was something that went through my mind to think, we still have this rudimentary notion because there were traditions where eating a body meant something. And this tradition has pushed its way forward in time. Now, why is that? How is it? It seems crazy. And lots of religious traditions have things that an outsider looks at and says, that is just nutso. Right? I mean, I don't know about you, but the notion of what happened leading up to the Passover, you hear about how the Hebrew people were in Egypt, and there was this series of plagues, and you thought, oh my God, this character God, he is really not a nice dude. You know, there are locusts, and there are rains of blood, and there are the boil. You know, yeah, you're able to list them. You know, it's something I try to put out of mind. It's really, you know, nowadays you see it on Supernatural. You don't necessarily, you don't necessarily think, wow, I'm going to pray to that, because that's really what I think of God. The notion of Buddha hanging out for days and days and days and days and not eating. I mean, doesn't it stretch the imagination a little bit? I think one of the things that as people outside of any religious traditions, we can look at other traditions and say, that's just crazy. That's just crazy. I mean, I remember a conversation with my former father-in-law, and he was like, oh, those Hindus, they just are so, they're just crazy. And I thought, okay, you who believe all of these things have the nerve to call these people crazy. And it was like, well, the Hindus never did anything for anybody, you know, so it's all, you know, the only place that's ever done anything for anybody are the Christians.
Oh, boy.
Okay.
That's why we had the Crusades.
Okay, yeah, well, and again, bubble overhead, because I knew not to get into that. I knew not to be able to say, well, let's see, how Christian were the Christians in the midst of the Crusades? How Christian were the Christians in the midst of witch burning?
Right.
And calling any woman, if she was a healer, then suddenly she was bad because, oh, people encountered her and they were better after that.
Yeah.
They went to the priest and they were not so much better. So what do you do rather than saying, I guess we as priests could learn something from her and her tradition? No, it's burn her and see her as bad. I think that religions can illustrate the breadth and depth of human capacities and human degradations. We can use religions as a mask to account for all kinds of good. Like my father-in-law saying, no one's ever done any good except Christianity. Well, you know, Mother Teresa was in India where she was doing her good work. And then that good work spread out all over the world. And Mother Teresa was not on a missionary zeal. Mother Teresa was on a zeal of healing, a zeal of wellness, a zeal of seeing the divine in everyone that she encountered. So she encouraged and led other women to care for the untouchables. There was no caste that was beyond their reach. She belonged to a religious order. And she felt that the order where she was in didn't work for her. She had stopped having a sense of the numinous. She was like, this can't be right. My mission as a nun, there's something wrong with it. There's something missing. And rather than holding her back, or the Reverend Mother, rather than saying, well, you're just screwed. You are completely effed up. I don't know what to do with you, Teresa, but let's get it together. Come on. It wasn't that. They sent her to find what her mission was. That was her religious tradition, letting her be in a flow, and her being in that flow, moving all of the world forward. So I'm having my first communion, and I'm reading this story from the Acts of the Apostles about how these people, having heard and having learned this lesson, were changed. They engaged in the world differently. I remember one time after my first communion, probably 10 years later, my mother is a very, very devout person. And so I learned from her that after communion, there were certain prayers that I was supposed to go through, because I had taken in the body of Christ. So now there was this Christ within me. And I was supposed to be essentially, the practice was about contemplating that there was this union of the divine within me. And to contemplate that. But I didn't have the words for that as a 7-year-old or as a 10-year-old. But at 14, rather than closing my eyes and trying to hold on to the contemplation, and contemplation, as you know, can happen in any number of ways. But for me, the recitation of prayers was not leading me to a numinous place. It wasn't taking me into that sense of connection with the divine that had come into me, that I had said, I am a place through which the divine is going to express. So I did what was really unthinkable in my family. I just spent the time contemplating the people going to communion. One by one. Seeing people come up. Seeing the people who were distributing the bread. And this was a point in the Catholic Church where you would not only get bread, but you'd also get wine. So there were people in line for the bread, and then they'd go for the sip of the wine. And what struck me was that this community of people together, this was the body of Christ. The body of Christ may have been symbolized in the bread or may have been transubstantiated into the bread. I don't know what exactly that bread, what it meant, but what it meant to me was, here was a people who were gathered together in shared belief, in shared faith, in shared communion. And that's when it occurred to me that what religion is that it's that shared communal experience. A friend of mine at school, he identifies as not as a devout religious Jew, but as a Jew who says, it's so important. Social justice is my spiritual practice. Standing up for what is right, arguing and pursuing and having a greater understanding of what is right is my religion. In the song that Crystal Harris sang, my religion is love. I remember my frustration with my religious experience. We would all go for communion, and then after the service, people would rush out of church and get into their cars and be like ready to run each other over, trying to get out of the parking lot. It's like, can I get out any faster? Because I've got places to go, things to do, people to see. And I'm done with all of you. And I remember thinking how ironic it was. And I'm an adolescent, and I'm a young adult, and I'm in a place of judgment about how these old people, they just don't get it. They don't get what it means to have come together to be that body of Christ, and then you go around and act like that. That's certainly not the body of God. Is that really how God is? He's going to run over the first person that gets in the path? I can't speak for any of you, but I know that I hear things today about people that identify in a certain way. I'm a good Christian. And as a good Christian, it should be this way, and this way, and this way. Just everything, that I'm not like constantly typing on Facebook. Trying to say, how are you a good Christian when you do this? I mean, I have actually reposted some of the things that ask those questions. If you're a good Christian, then why are you knocking down a woman? Why are you standing in a place of judgment? And then the problem is then I'm in this place of judgment. And so I'm just carrying forward all of the ugliness that gets acted out. I want to share with you one of the things that was identified. Religion provides a prophetic voice and compass for society. Using the power of stories to call humanity to higher moral standards for all of society, those in that religion and not. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Why is religion important in this month of thinking awareness is not enough? Well, it comes back to my wrestling with those people racing to get out of church and my judgment about their race to get out of church, because, my golly, we all just said we are the body of God, and we're acting like this. You know, do I go regularly stubbing my toe and say, there, you deserve that? You know, banging my head against the wall. I see, you deserve that. How do we treat our body? Awareness is a first step. If you're completely unaware, you really have very little room. Heard a speaker, and I'll look it up for who it was, but he identified 3 A's, and I'd like us to consider these as ways to be in our religious experiences, to be in our spiritual experiences, and to move forward. There is awareness, and awareness is understanding about the what of our lives. Because when we're unaware, I have blundered through all sorts of things in a completely unaware way. I remember when I was getting my divorce, I had so many sad stories about how victimized I was. How my ex-wife did all kinds of things that just made me miserable. It was all done to me. It was tragic. You know, and I was so good at it. I could even have, you know, I went into the hospital. I was really depressed. And the doctor said, you know, you have reason to be depressed. You know, when that was said to you, that's a depressing sort of thing to be said. You know, so I sucked him in. See, I'm a victim. I got affirmed. I'm not just thinking I'm crazy. I got outside acknowledgement that I was a victim. And I could feel the way I feel. And that's part of what I heard people say. You're feeling angry. Your body is like not doing what it's supposed to do, and doggone it, it's like you've been operating just fine for all this time. Get back with the program. I have no patience for you. Stop it. The awareness lets us see what's going on. The next thing is to ask the why. Awareness and assumptions. With assumptions, why is it going the way it's going? A lot of times, we don't get to that level because we're so inundated, and I'm sure that Tane could tell us, and Stephanie as a practitioner, how many times does our story just go on and on and on? This endless story. The notion of assumptions is what's underneath it. Why is this story going on? Why is this particular thing repeating over and over again? Why is it that my ex-wife and my first boyfriend had so many things in common? Oh, that would have been me. That would have been my inability to do certain things. Like know what my own limits were, to be able to know that I could say yes or I could say no. The assumptions. What are our assumptions? What are our beliefs? What is it that is letting us go on? And oftentimes we're just perfectly happy to ignore our assumptions. I'm right. I don't know. Has anybody ever heard someone that's always right? They're right, and their position is always right, and it doesn't matter what anybody else says, but they're right. I'll let you imagine that there might be someone, or some things, or some people that are in that position of they're always right. Then after assumptions, digging down and looking at the whys, how it is that we got there. The last piece is the action. Because if we simply know the what, that story that goes on and on and on, and now we are enlightened, we know our whys. I know why I did this. Have you ever encountered anyone, including yourself, that you know what the whys are, but you still keep doing the same darn thing? It's like, oh, yes, I'm doing this because, what are the excuses? Because I've always done it. I really don't know another way to do it. It's too hard to do it any other way. I can't just get out of this habit. It's not so easy. If you only were in my shoes, you'd understand what it is to walk in my shoes. But you don't. So back off. Give me a little understanding. And the problem is that oftentimes we've gotten that understanding and we're just maintained in our assumptions and we're maintained in our awareness. Action is the treat and move our feet. What are we willing to do? Religious expression only has meaning by taking action in the world. I talked about Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa and the order of nuns that she brought about were known for their actions. Mother Teresa at one point was visiting in New York City, and the New York City was like, well, what can we do for you? How can we advance your ministry? And she's like, give my sisters something that they can put on their cars so they stop getting ticketed and they stop getting towed. She had a very specific thing that could be done. It wasn't all just about, well, you can pray a little longer, or you can go visit the people with AIDS or HIV in the clinics, you can go visit the orphans. She's like, just give my sisters a permit so that they can access these parking places so they can do the work that they're trying to do. She was a very practical person. What permits do we need in our lives to take the actions that we need to take? I know that Stephanie and Charlie have both been wrestling with the notion of jobs. Neither one of them want a job.
Yep, that's true.
So that not wanting a job, as we've all talked about, what we really want, what's at the core of our being, manifests out in the world. It's very hard to get the job when we don't want it. The universe is very happy to comply with us. You know, that whole notion that I've talked about before, it's you know, we go exactly where we're directed, where we're looking. My ski falls over and over on my first day of skiing. I kept looking at the ground and I kept being on the ground. I only skied into the ground. It was somebody saying, look where you want to go. Stop looking at your darn feet. Oh, wow. I looked uphill and now I'm skiing uphill. Who could have thought that was even possible? I'm skiing uphill. And I'm stopped now because I'm in this awkward position. But what is it that we want? Where is it that we want to go? Religion can inspire us about where it is that we want to go. It's been said that revelation is the way that the divine reveals itself to humanity. And that religion is the way that humanity seeks out the spiritual.
Say that again.
It's been said that revelation is the way that the divine seeks out humanity. It's like when I talked about those numinous moments, that something just opens up inside of us. That the divine is present all places, all wheres, all times. That's my underlying assumption. That there's no place that the divine is not. That the divine is continually ready to reveal revelation. Religion is that turnaround. Because sometimes we have not put ourselves in a place to even be receptive to what's being revealed to us. I don't know, has any of you ever walked by a flower and not even noticed the flower? Or thought, oh, what a beautiful flower. Or it's like, oh yeah, it's pretty. Religion is a means that we pursue the divine. We came here today pursuing something. Does the divine show up in community? Does the divine show up in message? Does the divine show up in being able to see each other? How does it show up? Our religious experiences are ways that we commit to seeking the divine. So, aware, assume, and act. Think of those three things wherever we are. And we're in a better position than simply being unaware. And so